June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, France. The sea boiled with ships. From horizon to horizon, thousands of Allied vessels filled the channel. Destroyers, transports, landing craft, and massive floating pontoons being towed through rough, steel-gray waves. Rain lashed across decks. The wind howled like artillery fire. Yet beneath the chaos, there was precision, a colossal, silent orchestration of men and machines moving toward destiny. Captain James "Jimmy" Farrell of the Royal Engineers stood on the deck of a tugboat, clutching a soaked clipboard to his chest. His eyes squinted through salt spray as he watched a bizarre sight behind them. A vast structure of concrete caissons, steel roadways, and floating platforms stretching nearly a mile in tow. To anyone unfamiliar, it looked like a convoy of strange, half-built ships. To Farrell, it was the most daring engineering gamble in modern warfare. The Mulberry Harbor. "Keep her steady!" he shouted above the roar of the sea. The men on deck nodded, straining at ropes and winches as another wave slammed against the hull. The convoy shuddered, but the floating sections held. They had to. The invasion depended on it. Behind Farrell, a Royal Navy officer, Lieutenant Commander William Moffat, adjusted his binoculars. He scanned toward the dark silhouette of the French coast, where the thunder of naval bombardment echoed like distant earthquakes. "If this works," he muttered, "we'll build a port right under Jerry's nose." Farrell smiled grimly. "It has to work." As dawn broke, the scale of Operation Overlord came into focus. Beaches erupted under artillery. Landing craft opened their ramps into gunfire. Men stormed through surf, stumbling over the dead and wounded. Above them, Spitfires and Thunderbolts strafed German positions. Yet behind this horror, behind every tank and crate of ammunition, was a question that haunted the planners. How do you supply an army across beaches without a port? The Germans had expected the Allies to strike where a harbor could be seized intact, perhaps Cherbourg or Calais. But the Allies knew any port would be mined, barricaded, or destroyed long before capture. So, in secret, British engineers had designed something audacious. To build their own harbors from scratch, assemble them in England, tow them across the Channel, and anchor them off Normandy within days. As the fighting raged inland, Farrell's tug reached its designated anchorage off Omaha Beach. He looked toward shore, a hellscape of smoke, fire, and bodies. Landing craft were stacked on each other in the surf. Wrecked Shermans burned beside drowned men and twisted iron, and yet, amid the carnage, the engineers worked, driving piles, laying pontoons, bolting sections of roadway in the surf. By nightfall, Farrell's crew had secured the first Phoenix caisson, a hollow concrete block the size of a warehouse, to its moorings. It began to sink, slowly, perfectly, settling onto the seabed like a monolith. One down, dozens to go. Across the Channel, in occupied France, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel received his first reports of massive enemy shipping and unusual construction activity off the beaches. His staff officers were puzzled. What were the Allies doing? Building fortifications? Fuel depots? Some thought it was debris from wrecked transports. None imagined it was the foundation of a man-made port. Rommel's adjutant scribbled the message into his logbook. "Enemy appears to be establishing floating structures off the coast. Purpose unknown." Unknown, yes. But within a week, that purpose would become clear, and the German command would be forced to confront a reality no one in Berlin had anticipated. The Allies had turned the English Channel itself into a supply highway. As the wind howled over the waves that night, Farrell stood on deck beside Moffat. In the distance, fires from the invasion still flickered across the coast like dying embers. "Tomorrow," Moffat said quietly, "we start building a harbor out of the sea." Farrell looked out at the floating shapes rocking in the darkness. hundreds of steel and concrete pieces waiting for their moment. "Then God help us," he replied, "because the tide waits for no one." The sea rolled on, the invasion pressed inland, and the miracle of engineering that would shock the German High Command was only just beginning to rise from the water. The next morning, June 7th, 1944, dawn broke over a coastline still burning. The air smelled of smoke, salt, and cordite. Ships drifted in every direction, some damaged, others unloading tanks and supplies onto the battered beaches of Normandy. Captain Jimmy Farrell hadn't slept. His uniform was stiff with salt and grime, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. But when he climbed onto the deck that morning and looked out toward the horizon, what he saw filled him with awe. A floating city was taking form. All around him, Royal Engineers, Seabees, and Navy crews were assembling the components of the Mulberry Harbor. Massive concrete Phoenix caissons, some weighing 6,000 tons, were being towed into position and sunk to form the breakwater. Steel pontoons, called whales and beetles, were linked together to create floating roadways. Gigantic pier heads, known as spuds, rose and fell with the tide on hydraulic legs, ready to receive ships. The work was relentless, dangerous, and unending. Men balanced on swaying girders as cranes swung overhead. Welding sparks hissed in the sea wind. Every few hours, the thunder of distant artillery rolled inland as the front pushed deeper into France. But the engineers barely noticed. Their battle was with the ocean itself. Lieutenant Commander Moffat barked orders through a loudhailer. "Secure that beetle. Get that cable tight. If the tide rips it loose, it'll drag half the pier with it." A crew of American Seabees, broad-shouldered men from the 108th Naval Construction Battalion, hauled at the heavy mooring lines, shouting to be heard over the surf. "These damn waves never quit," one of them yelled. Farrell grinned through the spray. "Neither do we." By the end of the day, the first complete line of floating roadway stretched from sea to shore. Trucks began to roll across, loaded with fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. What had been an open beach 48 hours earlier now functioned as a bustling port. And this was only one of two harbors. Another, Mulberry B, was rising off Arromanches at the British sector of Gold Beach. Together, the two would become Mulberry A, American, and Mulberry B, British, twin artificial ports capable of unloading thousands of tons of supplies each day. To the Germans, the entire concept defied belief. On June 8th, aerial reconnaissance from the Luftwaffe's 5th Air Fleet returned with photos of strange shapes dotting the Normandy coastline, rows of what appeared to be concrete blocks and floating piers. The officers in charge dismissed them as wrecks or obstacles. But by June 10th, those wrecks were unmistakably alive with movement. Trucks, cranes, ships unloading cargo, men swarming like ants over a steel causeway stretching into the sea. When the photos reached Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, he is said to have stared at them in disbelief. "They are building a port on the water," he muttered. "That is madness." Madness. But it worked. Back on the ground, Farrell stood at the end of a floating pier, his boots slick with seawater. He watched a Liberty ship inch closer, guided by tugboats. The ship's hull dwarfed everything around it. "Easy, easy," he whispered. The vessel's gangway lined up perfectly with the floating platform. Cheers erupted. Within minutes, trucks were driving off the ship, carrying crates marked rations, ammunition, and fuel. It had taken less than 3 days to turn open ocean into a functioning supply port. Over the radio, General Eisenhower's staff received the first reports. Mulberry's operating at capacity. Continuous delivery of vehicles and supplies achieved. The success stunned even the Allied planners. By June 12th, over 4,000 tons of supplies were being unloaded daily, By June 17th, the figure doubled. The miracle of logistics was working, but the sea, as always, had its own plans. Farrell felt it first, the change in the wind, the low growl of waves growing stronger with each hour. Moffat checked his barometer, frowning. Pressure's dropping, fast. A storm was coming, and it would soon test whether the greatest engineering feat of the war could survive the fury of the Atlantic. June 18th, 1944. The morning broke with a strange, uneasy silence. The sea had darkened, the wind had changed direction, and the air carried the sharp taste of coming violence. Off the coast of Normandy, men paused in their work, staring out toward the horizon as the first heavy waves began to roll in. Captain Jimmy Farrell gripped the railing of his tugboat, watching the waters grow restless. The Mulberry Harbor, his harbor, stretched across the bay in a vast network of pontoons, caissons, and floating piers. It was a marvel of human ingenuity. And now it was about to face the one enemy no engineer could outplan, the sea itself. "Barometers dropped again," Moffat muttered, clutching a clipboard that was already flapping in the wind. "It's a channel gale. Force 9, maybe 10. Farrell swore under his breath. "Anchor everything we can. Double the moorings. If the breakwaters hold, we might ride it out." But within hours, the calm broke. The wind came screaming in from the northwest, hammering the coast with hurricane force. The sea exploded against the concrete caissons. Waves 30 feet high pounded the floating roadways, ripping apart the joints and tearing loose entire sections. Men ran along the piers, ropes in hand, trying to secure the lines. It was useless. The roar of the storm drowned every order. A pontoon broke free and slammed into another, splintering the metal decking like matchwood. Farrell saw one of his men, Corporal Andrews, disappear beneath the surge, swept off the pier before anyone could reach him. "Cut the cables. Cut them before they drag the whole line under," Moffat shouted. Sparks flew as torches sliced through metal. The wind howled like artillery fire. For 48 hours, the storm raged with unrelenting fury, battering the fragile structures that had been built in record time. By the second night, the American harbor at Omaha, WWII, was a ruin. Caissons lay broken in the surf. The floating piers had twisted into unrecognizable heaps of steel. Of the hundreds of components towed across the channel, half were now wrecked or sunk. At dawn on June 20th, Farrell stood on what remained of the breakwater, staring at the devastation. The sea was calm again, as if mocking them, for wreckage floated everywhere. Pontoons, vehicles, even crates of supplies scattered like flotsam. The men worked in silence, dragging survivors ashore and collecting what equipment they could salvage. One of the Seabee foremen, his face caked with salt and exhaustion, looked at Farrell. "We built a miracle," he said hoarsely, "and the sea tore it down in 2 days." Farrell didn't reply. He looked north, toward Arromanches, where the British harbor, Mulberry Bay, had survived. Its engineers had chosen a more sheltered bay, and though battered, its breakwaters still stood. Ships were already resuming unloading operations. A radio crackled to life on the deck. Moffat lifted it, listening to the distant voice of an Allied logistics officer. "Mulberry A damaged beyond repair. Abandon recovery operations. Mulberry B remains operational. Supplies will be rerouted." Farrell's jaw tightened. "We'll start loading our sections for Arromanches," he said. "If we can't rebuild here, we'll help them there." Moffat gave a tired smile. "You don't give up, do you?" "Neither does the war." By that afternoon, the decision was made. All efforts would focus on preserving the British Mulberry, codenamed Port Winston, at Arromanches. It would now bear the full weight of the Allied supply line. As Farrell's crew towed the surviving pieces northward, the scale of the damage came into view. Omaha's shore was littered with twisted metal, half-sunken ships, and shattered caissons. Yet amid the wreckage, the determination of the men never faltered. They had seen what could be done. They had built the impossible once, and the impossible still stood just miles up the coast. In the days that followed, Arromanches became a symbol of defiance. Engineers from across the Allied front converged there to repair, reinforce, and expand what remained. Within a week, Port Winston was running at near full capacity. Ships lined up offshore, unloading tanks, trucks, and fuel drums onto floating piers that swayed gently with the tide. And far inland, in a villa near La Roche-Guyon, the German High Command finally began to understand what they were up against. Reports flooded in. Enemy supplies landing continuously at artificial port structures off Arromanches. Harbor resistant to bombing due to breakwater design. Impossible to interdict effectively. Field Marshal Rommel read the dispatches in disbelief. "They have built a port where there was no port," he said quietly, "and they are landing an army through it." He turned to his staff. "Tell Berlin, we have underestimated them, completely." June 22nd, 1944. Inside a requisitioned chateau near La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat before a long oak table, maps of Normandy spread out before him. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and damp wool. Around him stood his senior officers, von Rundstedt, Bayerlein, and Speidel, each holding a stack of reconnaissance photos fresh from Luftwaffe aerial patrols. Rommel leaned forward, his blue eyes narrowing as he studied the grainy images. They showed rows of ships unloading cargo, long pier-like structures extending from the sea, and strange rectangular shadows forming a semicircle offshore. "Those shapes," he muttered, "they were not there last week." General Bayerlein cleared his throat. "Herr Feldmarschall, these are not ships. They are fixed structures. The British and Americans have built some sort of artificial port." Rommel's head snapped up. "A port? Out there? In open water?" Speidel stepped forward, setting down another photograph. "Yes, sir. Concrete caissons. They appear to form a breakwater. Inside, floating bridges connect to the beach. Our analysts estimate hundreds of individual components. It's, quite literally, a harbor on the sea." Rommel stared at the photo, speechless. The image showed the shoreline at Arromanches, hundreds of trucks rolling down long steel roads that shimmered with spray. Liberty ships, tankers, and landing craft clustered within a calm lagoon entirely shielded by the artificial breakwater. Behind the beach, columns of tanks were already pushing inland. Von Rundstedt shook his head slowly. "It's impossible. How could they construct such a thing under fire?" Rommel exhaled sharply. "They didn't build it here. They built it in England and brought it with them." A heavy silence fell across the room. Even the clinking of the typewriters in the next chamber seemed distant now. The realization hit them like a shell burst. The Allies hadn't just invaded. They had engineered their own logistics base from scratch. Rommel turned to his aide. "How much are they landing through this port?" The reply came quickly. "Intelligence suggests over 8,000 tons of supplies per day, sir. Possibly more." Rommel slammed his hand against the table. 8,000 tons. That means tanks, fuel, ammunition, everything they need to sustain a full army. We cannot stop an enemy who can feed his army directly from the sea. He looked again at the photograph, tracing the line of the floating causeways with one finger. "You see this? They have outthought us. Every assumption we made, every plan built around destroying French ports. It means nothing now. The channel itself is their harbor." Across the room, von Rundstedt muttered, "Then this war in France is already lost." But Rommel didn't answer. He turned back to the map, marking the coastline with a pencil. His expression hardened. "Then we destroy it," he said finally. "Every piece, every caisson, every pier section. I want airstrikes, artillery bombardment, send E-boats, send U-boats, whatever we have left." The orders went out within hours. Luftwaffe bomber groups from the 2nd Air Fleet were tasked with night raids on Arromanches. Small torpedo boats prowled the coast, searching for a gap in the Allied screen. But every attack failed. The Mulberry Harbor was protected by anti-aircraft guns, smoke screens, and Allied fighter patrols that ruled the skies. Bombs splashed harmlessly into the sea. Torpedoes hit the outer caissons and exploded uselessly against the massive concrete blocks. A captured German officer later described his reaction when he saw the harbor for the first time from the air. "It was like looking down on a steel spiderweb floating on the ocean. It seemed to breathe. Trucks moving, cranes lifting, ships docking. I thought to myself, this is not war, this is industry." Back at Arromanches, Captain Farrell and his men continued their relentless work. New sections arrived daily, towed from England and linked to the surviving structures. They had heard the storm had destroyed the American harbor, but that only fueled their determination. By July, Port Winston, the British Mulberry, was fully operational. Every tide brought in new cargo. Every day, men unloaded food, ammunition, and reinforcements faster than the Germans could comprehend. Rommel's intelligence reports grew darker. "Enemy logistics uninterrupted," one read. "Artificial port proving invulnerable." Another noted grimly, "Supplies landing at rate equivalent to a major continental harbor. Impossible to disrupt." When the reports reached Berlin, even Hitler's inner circle refused to believe them. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, reportedly dismissed the accounts as British exaggeration. But Rommel knew better. He leaned over the table one last time, eyes fixed on the map. "They have built an army that floats," he said quietly. "And when an army can bring its port with it, it can land anywhere." He looked out the window toward the west, where thunder rolled over the horizon. "We are fighting men who think like engineers, and that," he murmured, "may be the most dangerous enemy of all." July 1944. The beaches of Normandy no longer resembled the chaotic killing grounds of D-Day. They were now a living organism, pulsing with energy, motion, and the unending rhythm of war. From dawn until dusk, the Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches, Port Winston, thrummed like the heart of the Allied invasion. Captain Jimmy Farrell walked the length of a floating pier, his boots clanging against steel decking that swayed gently under his weight. Around him, cranes groaned, trucks revved, and men shouted orders through the din. Cargo nets swung overhead, unloading crates marked munitions, rations, and medical. Every sound, every movement was part of a machine that had turned the tide of the war. He passed a group of American GIs watching in awe as a convoy of Sherman tanks rolled off a Liberty ship, one after another, straight onto the floating roadways. "Damn," one of them muttered. "They built a city out here." Farrell smiled. "A city that feeds an army." By mid-July, the numbers spoke for themselves. Over 1 million tons of cargo, 500,000 vehicles, and 2 million soldiers had come ashore through the beaches and the Mulberry systems. Every round of ammunition fired in the push toward St. Lo, every gallon of fuel driving Patton's tanks through France, had likely passed through Port Winston. The harbor had become the logistical miracle that Eisenhower's entire invasion plan depended on. Without it, the advance inland might have stalled, the Allied beachhead strangled by lack of supply. Instead, the flow of men and material was constant, unstoppable, a river of war pouring from the sea. And through it all, Farrell's engineers kept it alive, every bolt replaced, every pontoon realigned, every roadway recalibrated to match the shifting tides. They knew the war would not wait for maintenance. On one particularly foggy morning, Farrell stood beside Lieutenant Commander Moffett as another convoy of supply ships approached through the mist. The sea was calm now, the same sea that had once destroyed Mulberry. Farrell ran a hand along the rusted railing, feeling the hum of engines through the metal. "All this," he said quietly, "started as drawings on a table." Moffat nodded. "And laughter from the skeptics. Remember that." Farrell smiled faintly. "They said we couldn't build a harbor out of the ocean. They were wrong." From the cliffs above Arromanches, British officers watched as columns of trucks rolled inland toward Caen and beyond. The floating harbor, from their vantage point, looked almost organic, a vast metallic coral reef pulsing with movement. Allied war correspondents described it as the eighth wonder of the world, a phrase that quickly made its way into headlines back home. Meanwhile, in Germany, the shock had turned to resignation. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Allies had not only created a functioning port, but had expanded it faster than the Luftwaffe could react. Bombing raids had failed to cause lasting damage. Even sabotage attempts by German frogmen were thwarted by relentless patrols and radar. In a report sent to Berlin, a senior German naval officer wrote, "The enemy's floating ports are an engineering achievement beyond comprehension. They have rendered our coastal defenses obsolete. The Channel is no longer a barrier. It is their highway." By August, with the breakout from Normandy underway and Allied forces surging toward Paris, the Mulberry Harbor had achieved its purpose. It was no longer just a temporary solution. It was the artery through which victory flowed. When the fighting finally moved beyond range of the coast and permanent ports like Cherbourg were reopened, Port Winston began to quiet. The floating piers were dismantled piece by piece, some sections reused for other operations, others left to rust beneath the waves. But its impact never faded. On the final day of his service at Arromanches, Captain Farrell stood at the edge of the last pier still anchored in place. The sea was calm, the sky clear. Around him, the sounds of war had receded into the distance. He lit a cigarette and watched the tide lap against the battered steel pontoons that had carried a nation's hopes. Moffat joined him, hands in his pockets. "Strange, isn't it? We fought the sea and somehow we won." Farrell exhaled smoke into the wind. "No," he said softly. "We learned to work with it." Below them, the waves rolled gently against the remains of the harbor, a monument not of stone or marble, but of steel, salt, and sweat. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories in war are not won by generals or soldiers, but by the quiet hands of men who build. Years later, when historians studied the success of the D-Day invasion, they would call the Mulberry Harbors one of the most extraordinary feats of engineering ever attempted, a blend of vision, desperation, and ingenuity that changed the course of history. For the men who were there, men like Jimmy Farrell and the thousands who worked beside him, it had been more than an invention. It had been a promise kept, a defiance of the impossible, a bridge between the shores of freedom and the heart of Europe. And as the tide carried the last pieces of Port Winston into history, it left behind a legacy written not in words, but in waves, proof that even in war's darkest hour, humanity's creativity could light the way to victory.